The dark truth: shallow people rise while depth gets ignored. Have you ever watched someone rise to fame or influence and thought to yourself, this person has nothing to say, so why is everyone listening? If you've had that moment, that flash of confusion followed by frustration, you're not alone. There's a dark truth in the structure of our society that most people aren't ready to admit. Shallow people rise, while the deep ones, the thinkers, the questioners, the ones who actually feel the weight of existence, get ignored. And not just ignored. Often ridiculed, dismissed, or even silenced. Why is that? Why does depth repel the crowd while banality attracts it like a magnet? That's the question we're going to rip wide open. And if you're willing to go there, you're about to discover something that might permanently change the way you see the world and yourself. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Most people don't want the truth. They say they do, but they don't. They want comfort. They want simplicity. They want clarity without complexity, answers without questions, and narratives that make them feel good about their place in the world. People, those who think, who feel, who challenge, who see, they disrupt that. They introduce friction. They force us to slow down, to reflect, to question what we've accepted without thought. And in a world addicted to speed, distraction, and surface-level validation, they are treated like a virus in a system designed for shallow efficiency.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
We live in a society of algorithms. Algorithms amplify what's loud, what's shiny, what's emotionally simple. They reward repetition, not revelation. They reward confidence, not contemplation. They reward personalities that are easy to digest, not souls that are hard to define. So when a shallow person, someone who is charismatic, confident, and uncomplicated, enters the stage, they become magnetic. Their shallowness becomes an asset. Their lack of depth becomes a kind of social lubricant. They don't challenge you. They affirm you. They keep things light, funny, predictable. And for the average person, that's exactly what they crave. But what happens to the deep ones? The ones carrying entire galaxies in their minds? The ones who can't unsee the contradictions in life, or unfeel the weight of suffering, or unthink the hard questions that keep them up at night. They often find themselves isolated. Not because they're wrong, but because they're too right. Their presence can feel heavy, their words too precise, their silence too loud. They don't play the game, they don't flatter the crowd. They speak from a place that doesn't need applause, and that terrifies people who are addicted to it. Here's the paradox: the deeper you are, the harder it is to connect. Not because you're incapable, but because there are fewer people swimming in those waters. Most are paddling on the surface, afraid to dive. And when you speak from depth, it doesn't land. It echoes. It confuses. It challenges. And people mistake that discomfort for arrogance or awkwardness or weirdness. But really, it's just what happens when someone speaks from truth in a world built on performance. So ask yourself this: have you ever silenced your depth because it made others uncomfortable? Have you ever pretended to be lighter, simpler, less intense, so you wouldn't be too much? If you have, don't shame yourself. You're not alone. Most people with depth have learned to hide it. Not because they want to, but because they've been punished for showing it. In school, at work, in relationships. Depth gets called dramatic, complicated, negative, intense. But what most people call intensity is really just reality without filters. And the world isn't ready for that. Not yet. Now, let's dig deeper. Why is this system so upside down? Why does the loudest voice win over the wisest mind? Why do we follow people who entertain us, not those who awaken us? The answer lies in our biology and our culture. Biologically, we are wired for survival, not truth. Our brains evolved to seek certainty and security, not existential insight. Ambiguity feels dangerous. Complexity feels threatening. So when someone offers a simple answer, even if it's wrong, we gravitate toward it. Culture amplifies this tendency. It trains us from birth to reward appearances over substance. We get likes for beauty, not for wisdom. We get promoted for confidence, not for contemplation. We vote for charisma, not character. And over time we learn depth is dangerous. Shallow wins. But here's the real tragedy. The people who could heal the world, change the conversation, elevate the collective mind, they're the ones who often go unheard. Because they're not shouting, they're not selling, they're not dancing for attention. They're observing, they're reflecting. They're waiting for a world wise enough to listen. And that world never comes unless we build it. So let me ask you something that might hurt a little. Are you part of the problem? Do you ignore the deep because it's inconvenient? Do you scroll past thoughtfulness because it demands effort? Do you elevate the shallow because it makes you feel good, even if it makes you think less? If we want to live in a world that values depth, we have to stop rewarding its opposite. We have to stop giving our attention to what is hollow, because attention is currency, and every time we spend it on the shallow, we fund the very system that silences the deep. The truth is, the rise of shallow people isn't just a glitch in the system. It is the system, and until we challenge the system, the deep will stay buried. The hidden cost of being deep, why intelligence, emotion, and insight are treated like threats, let's be honest. Being a deep person in a shallow world doesn't just make life difficult, it makes it painful. Because what no one tells you is that intelligence, emotional sensitivity, and deep insight aren't just overlooked, they're often treated like threats. You would think that being able to think clearly, feel deeply, and observe life with precision would be considered a gift. But in reality, those qualities often become a burden. Not because they are inherently bad, but because they expose what others would rather keep hidden. And most people don't want to be exposed. They don't want their illusions touched. They don't want their comfortable narratives disrupted. So when they meet someone who sees too much, feels too much, or knows too much, they don't lean in, they recoil. Why? Because depth holds up a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous. The deeper you are, the more clearly you reflect the contradictions, the hypocrisy, the emptiness of what passes for normal in the world. And people don't like that. They don't want to be reminded that their lives are built on compromises they never questioned. They don't want to be shown that their version of truth is actually just a consensus trance reinforced by repetition. So when someone comes along who doesn't fit the script, who thinks differently, who feels more than they're supposed to, who questions what others blindly follow, they get labeled. Not as authentic, not as courageous, but as difficult, as too much. And that's the hidden cost of being deep. You'll be misunderstood more often than you'll be understood. You'll be punished for honesty, even if it's spoken with kindness. You'll be seen as arrogant for having clarity and seen as weak for having empathy. You'll be told you're overthinking when you're just thinking. You'll be told you're too sensitive when you're simply aware. And over time, if you're not careful, you'll internalize those messages. You'll start to believe that your depth is a defect, that your intelligence is a burden, that your emotions are liabilities. And if you believe that long enough, you'll begin to silence yourself. You'll shrink. You'll adapt. You'll pretend to be simpler than you are just to be accepted. But let me tell you something that might save you years of pain. Your depth is not the problem. The problem is a culture that rewards superficiality and punishes substance. A culture that fears truth because truth demands change. And people don't change easily. So instead of evolving, they attack the messenger. And when you're deep, you are always the messenger. Simply by existing as you are, you disrupt the illusion. Simply by breathing, you disturb the script. Now, here's the paradox. The world needs depth more than ever. We are drowning in distraction, division, and disconnection. We are suffocating under the weight of meaningless noise. And yet, the very people who could bring clarity, connection, and healing the deep ones are often the most silenced. Not because they're wrong, but because their presence makes mediocrity impossible to ignore. And mediocrity is sacred to those who have built their identity around it. So ask yourself this: how many times have you dimmed your light just so others wouldn't feel insecure? How many times have you apologized for being too intense when you were just being real? How many times have you swallowed truth to avoid conflict, even though the lie ate you from the inside out? If you've done that, it doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. But it also means you've been paying the hidden cost of depth, one that accumulates slowly, silently, until you don't even recognize yourself anymore. But it doesn't have to stay that way. The first step to reclaiming your depth is to stop apologizing for it. Stop shrinking to fit into shallow spaces. Stop editing your thoughts so they're easier to digest. Stop pretending you don't care when you care deeply. Because the world needs your insight. It needs your emotional complexity. It needs your questions, your reflections, your honesty. Even if it doesn't realize it yet. Even if it resists you, mocks you, or rejects you, keep showing up as you are. Because every time you do, you make it a little easier for someone else to do the same. And here's the truth they don't want you to know: the people who reject your depth are often the ones most afraid of their own. They see in you what they buried in themselves, and rather than dig it up, they push you away. But that's not your burden to carry. Your job is not to be liked. Your job is to be true. And truth, by its nature, will always be inconvenient to the shallow. Why the crowd worships the loud, the psychology behind popularity over substance. Let's confront another uncomfortable truth. People don't follow what's wise, they follow what's loud. Popularity is rarely a reflection of depth, meaning, or truth. It's a reflection of energy, repetition, and visibility. The louder you are, the more attention you get. And in a world where attention is the currency of influence, the loudest voices become the most powerful regardless of whether they have anything meaningful to say. This isn't just a modern problem, it's a human one. And to understand why shallow people rise while the deep are ignored, we have to understand the psychology of the crowd. Crowds are not rational. They don't think, they feel. They don't analyze, they react. The crowd is driven by emotion, not introspection. And loudness, whether it's in the form of volume, confidence, charisma, or controversy, triggers emotion. It bypasses logic and strikes directly at our primal instincts: excitement, fear, novelty, belonging. That's why someone can speak nonsense with absolute conviction and still be believed. Because the crowd doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Does this feel good?" And if it feels good, if it's entertaining, energizing, or affirming, it becomes gospel, no matter how empty it actually is. Now contrast that with the deep voice, the voice of reason, contemplation, or subtle truth. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It invites. It asks questions. It pauses. It leaves space for uncertainty. And the crowd doesn't know what to do with that. Because depth requires effort. It requires slowing down, thinking critically, holding contradictions, and wrestling with discomfort. And most people would rather be swept up in a wave of simple emotion than sit alone with the complex truth. So the deep voices are overlooked, drowned out, or mocked for being boring, too serious, or not engaging enough. And that's the system we live in, a system that trains us to confuse noise for wisdom, performance for authenticity, and confidence for competence. But think about how many people you've seen go viral, not because they had something important to say, but because they said anything with enough certainty and spectacle. Think about how many truly insightful individuals you know who remain invisible not because they lack value, but because they refuse to turn their truth into a circus act. They don't chase the algorithm. They don't package their thoughts into digestible sound bites, and so they are forgotten. But here's what's even more disturbing: the crowd wants it this way. Because deep voices threaten the illusion the crowd is addicted to. Loud voices entertain, distract, and reinforce the crowd's beliefs. Deep voices challenge, expose, and disrupt them. And when you disrupt the illusions that make people feel safe, they don't thank you, they attack. They call you pretentious. They say you're overthinking. They dismiss you as not relatable. But what they really mean is, "You're making me feel something I'm not ready to face." So ask yourself, how many times have you watched someone with nothing to say rise to influence simply because they were willing to be louder than everyone else? How many times have you seen someone with real depth stay silent because they didn't want to play that game? And more importantly, how many times have you chosen the loud over the true because it was easier, safer, more fun? It's easy to blame the system, easier still to blame the crowd. But the truth is, the crowd is made up of individuals, of you and me. And every time we choose shallow noise over deep thought, we reinforce the world we secretly wish would change. If we want to live in a culture where substance matters, we have to choose it. We have to stop clicking on what's loudest and start seeking what's real. We have to reward nuance, not just noise. We have to give our attention to voices that challenge us, not just flatter us. And let's be honest, being loud is easy. It doesn't take wisdom to shout. It doesn't take courage to entertain. But to speak the truth quietly, persistently, without the need for applause, that takes strength, that takes clarity. That takes a kind of inner power that can't be bought or borrowed. The real leaders of this world, the ones who actually move us forward, are rarely the ones standing in the spotlight. They're the ones working in the shadows, thinking deeply, living honestly, and waiting for a world that's ready to listen. But that world won't come on its own. We have to create it, one choice at a time, one conversation at a time, one refusal to be seduced by noise. So the next time you hear a loud voice, stop and ask yourself, is this person saying something, or just saying it louder than everyone else? And more importantly, why am I listening? Becoming heard without selling out how to stay deep in a loud world. So here's the final dilemma. If the world only listens to what's loud, does that mean the deep must shout to be heard? Do we have to sacrifice our authenticity, dilute our insights, and package our truth into entertaining fragments just to survive in this attention economy? That's the trap. That's the final test for anyone who carries depth in a shallow world. How do you stay true to yourself without becoming invisible? The answer isn't simple, but it is possible. You don't have to sell out, but you do have to adapt. There's a difference. Selling out means giving up your soul for attention. Adapting means learning how to translate your soul so it can be heard. If you're deep, you're not just competing with noise, you're speaking against it. And if you want to be heard, you can't just whisper in a storm and hope it stops. You have to learn how to speak in ways that cut through the chaos without becoming part of it. That starts with clarity. What are you really trying to say? What truth are you carrying that the world needs, even if it doesn't want it yet? Strip it down. Get to the essence. Because depth doesn't mean complexity for the sake of complexity. Real depth is clarity on the other side of chaos. It's the ability to take something overwhelming and distill it into something that pierces. You don't need to dumb yourself down, you need to sharpen your insight into something that can't be ignored, even by the shallow. Next, you need courage. Not the dramatic, showy kind, the quiet kind. The kind that allows you to say what's real even when no one claps. The kind that lets you live your truth even when it costs you attention, followers, or approval. Because if you bend your message to fit the crowd, it's no longer your message, it's theirs. And the world doesn't need more echoes. It needs original voices who are brave enough to stand alone until others catch up. But here's the twist, you don't have to stand alone forever. There are more deep people than you think. They're just quiet, hidden, watching, waiting for anyone to speak what they've been feeling for years but didn't have the words for. And when you speak with honesty, when you stay rooted in your own depth, you give those people permission to rise. You become a signal in the noise, a lighthouse, not for the masses but for those who matter. Still, the temptation will always be there, to go viral rather than go real, to chase numbers instead of meaning, to make your truth more palatable, more marketable, more relatable. But every time you do that, you chip away at something sacred. And in the end, popularity gained at the cost of authenticity is just another form of silence. You're still not being heard, you're just being approved of. And approval is a poor substitute for impact. So what do? You stay deep, you stay real, but you learn how to speak with precision. You learn how to meet people where they are without abandoning where you are. You learn the art of translation, how to take the depth of your experience and express it in a way that resonates without being reduced. That's not selling out. That's evolution. That's what philosophers, mystics, and revolutionaries have done throughout history. They didn't water down the truth, they delivered it in a way that people could finally hear. And maybe that's your job too. Not to compete with the noise, but to outlast it. Not to be the loudest in the room, but the most aligned. Not to win the crowd, but to wake it up one person at a time. So I'll leave you with one final question, and it's one that only you can answer. Are you willing to stay deep? Even if it means being overlooked, so that when you are finally heard, it's the real you that's being listened to. Because in the end, shallow fame fades. But depth echoes. And those echoes, they never die.